All right, Mike, let's talk a little bit about dynamics. Now, I know you have an interesting approach to this. I've even heard you coin a phrase that I'd never heard before, environmental dynamics. Is that what you call it?
Yes.
Okay, explain this to me.
Like for me, when you start learning about dynamics, like the first thing you think is soft to loud, or piano to forte. So it's a very vertical thing, and that only leaves you this dynamic headroom from from up and down, so you're moving in one direction. But to me, dynamics actually move in multiple directions. So it's almost like when you're measuring something, where you get the length, the width, and the height.
Yeah.
Everything. So when I'm thinking about this whole concept of environmental dynamics, and I'm making dynamic decisions, it's not just of how soft or quiet I'm playing. It's about how much air I'm pushing, and how much energy. So there is the whole vertical concept of it, of how loud or how soft am I playing. And that's actually needs to have a little bit of a boundary. So I call it, you gotta have to set the floor and the ceiling of it, of just what is the loudest point, because there's a point that I think people forget, musically with our instruments, that we can only be so loud.
Right. There's a point at which, for bass, plucking louder, grabbing the string more, is not getting louder. It actually, the string just starts hitting the frets or the pickup, and it just goes.
It's not louder. It's just giving up. There's a point to where every instrument, even on the drums, the individual instruments, or if you're playing guitar or bass, there's a point where the instrument's going to give up, and it's not going to sound its best. So you need to have a really firm grasp of what's loud, and also how that relates to everyone else. So
what can your instrument do?
And the same thing happens with quiet. Back to talking about being cute. There's so many times where people are playing so quiet, where it's even though that may be the lowest velocity you can play at, that's not a velocity that translates. It's not getting the full value out of the instrument. If I hit a drum real quietly, maybe I'm not getting both the top head and the bottom head working together.
Right.
Or the cymbal isn't opening up, or if I hit it too hard, it's opening too much. So I try to get a really good grasp of really within the course of the instruments being used and the section and the song, where is my floor and where is my ceiling?
Yeah, what do you have to work with? What's the space you have to work with?
Exactly.
And then you could use all that space to create those dynamics.
So the level between soft and loud, or the quietest and loudest, is dictated by that. So what you do is
what the
everything
instrument can do. Right.
As in what happens in between. And it allows you, I think, to be more musical at times too, to where, loud doesn't just become blatant bashing, because I physically can hit harder, I can physically pull harder, or my amp can physically turn the knob, and it's capable of going to 11.
Right.
So that's the up and down part of it. But there's also, when we talk about pulse, the forward motion of it.
Right, you mentioned pushing air versus, what did you just say?
Yeah, to me, it is about pushing air. There's that forward motions of just how much air I am pushing. Picture putting the setting on a fan, of just how hard that fan is blowing. And, and things need to breathe, but we need to keep that air pushing forward. And so as we're moving up and down vertically, and when we're moving forward, we're also generating more air. And to me, that air is energy.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about what the forward motion, what that end goal of really playing louder or softer is doing.
Right.
How it's translating out. And then in the other way, you could just look at how big that environment is. How big does that groove need to be? How wide does it need to be? So. And when you're pushing the air, if it's wider, sometimes it needs more air. If it's inside, you need to keep that air more controlled. So all these factors, and it's more of a conceptual thing. There's not a lot of exercises you can do to really understand that.
Would that kind of translate to complexity and not being complex? That I don't know, y-axis or whatever of this?
Yeah, I think the complexity definitely comes into the translation element of it. But I think overall, it's just kind of a concept. It's more of a theoretical thing. I think to get to wrap your mind around of it's not I'm just when I'm being dynamic, I'm not comfortable at quiet, and I'm comfortable at loud, and I can play this quiet, and I practice playing this quiet. I can play this loud because I'm physically in shape to play this loud. It's controlling the environment with your ears and making sure that you're moving up and down, forward and understanding the size and maybe controlling the size of, like, you want to think of it like a room, you know, but with the pulse, everything's just continually moving forward. Like another analogy I like to use for the environmental dynamics is if you picture a pipe and, like, you know, let's say, like, you know, like going to a faucet.
Okay.
So we can have all sorts of different size pipes. So that's kind of your floor and your ceiling, and also a little your width. You know, we're deciding just how big that groove is going to be. You know, what's the pipe for our groove?
Yeah.
We can run just a little bit of water through it and can control the intensity, or we can crank the faucet all the way and have a bunch of water come spilling out. And like I was just at a hotel recently where I cranked it all the way, and all of a sudden water's flying everywhere and everything. So what do? You get it back. You find the sweet spot. You know that, like, okay, like, it can only handle this, even though it did not function properly. Right. You know, I just ended up with a bunch of water everywhere. And then the other thing, when you're controlling the water, you're finding how to control, you know, pushing the amount of energy forward through that pipe, and then also, you know, you can make it hotter, you can make it colder, and, like, what do you do if you're making it warm? You're kind of mixing and match and finding the two. Right. And to me, that's dynamic control. Right. Like, you know, it's knowing what I'm dealing with, the circumstances I'm dealing with, the instrument I'm dealing with, and controlling it appropriately at that time.
Yeah, you might put
to get what I want. You know?
You might put that more practically in terms of what we talked about earlier, as far as, like, long notes and short notes. You know, putting that in your dynamic field here, like a short note can be loud or soft, just as the long notes, and that might create more air or less air.
Yeah, actually, I think the short notes actually create more air, because when you're cutting things off, it's like that space for decay, like for resolve. Right. Like, you know, like when air hits them, it's like, you know, anything hits them. If you throw water at a wall, it's gonna break up and it's gonna go everywhere. And everything. Like, I don't want things shattering. I don't want my groove shattering sonically. You know, I want things just to be able to push and decay and everything. So I'm leaving the space for that. But, you know, overall, it's, I think, just understanding the big picture dynamically of, like, you know, it's not just soft and loud. It's controlling your entire environment and how big you want something. And even, like, I like to call it the illusion of loud. There's times when people are like, oh, you're really digging in there. It's like, actually, I'm not. Like, I'm controlling things. I'm like, you know, like, soft and loud, like, are just relative terms. Yeah. You know, like, something can be really loud and then even louder. You know, so it's all just this kind of relativity. Yeah. So, you know, so sometimes, like, when I'm playing, I'm just kind of creating the illusion of loud. Yeah. You know, and even, like, you know, and I'm not being cute, getting too quiet. I'm playing appropriately.
I feel like intensity with how you play can make that feel like, if you're playing something really intense but quiet, it kind of feels loud. It gives a certain energy to it.
Yeah, you know, but there's one thing that I'd like to say, in that, like, when people use intensity a lot, like, it's used in such an athletic way of, like, you know, like a macho, like, intensity. But I think the big thing is, like, when you're playing with intent.
Intent.
You know, rather than like, it's like intent over intensity. Yeah. Intent, you know, because you know, you don't. You know, you want to play appropriate, and you want to play with proper intent, and not run things over. Like, so a lot of times as a drummer, and I think as a rhythm section in general, when we're playing together, we're finding ways that we can get underneath something and push air. So that's where we live in the environment, and, like, you know, and you know, so if I can be underneath something and pushing air, and, like, you know, it's in any case, like, I think especially with the drums that are just such a loud instrument by nature, like, you know, it's not just getting passionate and bashing. It's learning to always play with intent underneath, and loud is relative. And if you can have an illusion of loud, you're generating, you know, but you're still generating the proper amount of energy and air, I think you're in a really good place. Your physicality has nothing to do with it. It has to do with your air, the air you're pushing, and the environment that you're creating or controlling.
I think that's well said.
Thanks.